We can see Kyiv on the morning after the attack wave, one of the most intense waves of attacks since the war began. Dozens of people injured. Government offices were damaged, so were residential buildings, schools, a market. Also, media offices, including DW's Kyiv bureau, were damaged. The Russian attack included 600 drones and nearly 100 missiles in total. Many were intercepted by air defense systems, but not all, and above all, not the Oreshnik. What's striking is Ukraine knew the Oreshnik was coming. 24 hours before the attack, President Zelensky went public with a warning. Intelligence agencies had detected launch preparations at a Russian test range. He named Kyiv as the likely target. So it wasn't a surprise, but they still couldn't stop it. And I want to talk about this so-called wonder weapon, how it works, why Russia has now used it 3 times, and what it means for the war in Ukraine on the whole. And I'll be doing that with William Courtney, former U.S. ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia, veteran of U.S.-Soviet arms negotiations, and a senior fellow at the RAND Corporation think tank. He joins me now from Washington. William, Bill, thanks for joining me.
Sure.
So, Bill, let's start with the basics. The Oreshnik is described as a hypersonic missile. What does that actually mean?
A hypersonic missile is one that flies with the speed of traditional ballistic missiles, which are multiple times the speed of sound. But the hypersonic can maneuver in the upper atmosphere. And so this means that, for example, the reentry vehicles that it launches are harder to hit because of the movement and harder to detect as well. But it's not a weapon that is going to make any difference in the war. The Russians have used only 3 Oreshniks in this war. Oreshnik is designed to be a nuclear armed missile, not a conventional missile. It doesn't have the conventional prompt precision strike capability of a conventional missile. So it is just for show. It's to intimidate Ukrainians, but it's not going to make any difference in the war.
Now, I want to get to that in a second, why they're using it, as you say, to intimidate Ukraine, what impact that might have on the war, and its possible use to carry nuclear weapons, warheads, as you mentioned. First, I want to look at a different video, because I think it's important to understand the mechanism of how this technology works. If we can pull this up, this is Russia's first attack using the Oreshnik in 2024 on Dnipro. We see these flashes of light just before impact. Walk us through what's actually happening and how this technology works and what makes it different from other missiles.
Well, this is a multiple warhead missile. So most missiles like the Iskander that the Russians use, for example, have a single warhead. But the Oreshnik can launch up to 6 warheads, and they can separate from the missile way up in the upper atmosphere, or above that, actually. And the reentry vehicles then can be launched. They're independently targetable, so each reentry vehicle can be launched at a different target.
Now, the Russians are saying the Oreshnik is unstoppable. Is that true? Is there a defense system somewhere in the world capable of taking one of these down?
The Patriot anti-aircraft and anti-missile system has been able to take down some of them. So the Russians have another hypersonic missile called the Kinzhal, which President Putin introduced publicly in 2018, saying it was something that couldn't be stopped. And in fact, the Patriots in Ukraine have taken down quite a few of the Kinzhals. Oreshnik is a little harder, flies high. The reentry vehicles come straight down. So it's more difficult to hit.
Bill, what's also interesting about these attacks with the Oreshnik, based on the reporting that's available, some or maybe all 3 of these strikes used inert warheads, meaning basically that these were blanks. They didn't have explosives, and damage was caused from impact, not from an explosion. Why do you think that is? Why is Russia shooting blanks here?
The explosive really isn't needed to do much damage with something like a reentry vehicle from the Oreshnik, because the kinetic energy of the Oreshnik reentry vehicle itself can do enormous amount of damage because of the very high speed. with which it enters. So it really doesn't make a whole lot of difference. And again, the Oreshnik was designed for nuclear weapons, not for conventional weapons.
I want to talk about that again in just a second. First, I want to show a map of where the Oreshnik has been used so far and when. This is where they've used it so far. The missile is always launched from the Kapustin Yar test range in southern Russia. The first strike was in November 2024 on the city of Dnipro. The second came in January 2026 in the Lviv region, close to the Polish border, meaning close to NATO territory. And then the current attack, the latest on Bila Tserkva near Kyiv. Bill, do you see any kind of pattern in the choice of targets, or is this just arbitrary where they've used these missiles so far?
They're probably trying to achieve some kind of a political effect. But again, because the missiles, by comparison with all the other missiles and drones that Russia launched, last night, for example, against Kyiv and other places, the Oreshnik has done very little damage, extremely little damage. It's amusing in some respects. They launched from Kapustin Yar. This is where the captured German rocket scientists after World War II that the Soviets took. They took them to Abkhazia and Georgia, and then they went to Kapustin Yar to launch missiles across Kazakhstan.
Now, you're sort of downplaying the significance here of this technology, and I mean this because the Ukrainians knew it was coming. They did not manage to shoot it down, and it could have possibly carried a nuclear warhead, as you say, that is what this is built for. How far could Russia potentially fire the Oreshnik, and is there a way that the West could stop it if Ukraine itself cannot?
The United States has a system called ground-based mid-course defense, a GMD, to protect the main part of the United States. It probably could have a fair shot at it, but the reentry vehicles again are they're not all that large. They're flying in different directions, so it's not easy to hit.
Right, you said probably if it were targeted at the continental U.S., probably a fair shot at taking it down. What if Russia wanted to use this on Western Europe?
So this would be a very challenging scenario for Western Europe. There are Patriots, there are some other U.S. missiles, and the Europeans have some anti-missile capability, RST, for example, but this would be hard to hit.
If these missiles had been used with conventional or with nuclear warheads, explosives, how much more destructive would the strikes have been? And I'm wondering, would the Oreshnik actually be more destructive than other missiles delivering the same payload?
It is not. It would not be much more destructive. If you have slower flying missiles, for example, they don't have to be maneuverable. Some will be taken out, as the Ukrainians are doing, but the conventional explosion may not, offer much more advantage than the high kinetic energy reentry vehicle that has no explosive in it. Now, nuclear explosion, of course, would be much different. That in that case, the Russians could destroy a city. President Biden, when he was in power, warned President Putin early in the full-scale invasion of catastrophic consequences if Russia were to use a nuclear weapon, and there was some sign that the Russians were considering that. President Trump hasn't addressed that question directly, but the use of a nuclear weapon would have enormous significance.
We've also been watching European leaders today. I want to bring in some of their reactions to this attack. Let's start with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. He wrote on X, "The German government strongly condemns this reckless escalation. Germany remains firmly at Ukraine's side." EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen wrote, "Russia's massive attack on Ukraine last night shows the Kremlin's brutality and disregard for both human life and peace negotiations. Terror against civilians is not strength, it's despair." And here's what French President Emmanuel Macron wrote. France condemns this attack and the use of the Oreshnik ballistic missile, which above all reflects a dangerous escalation and the dead end of Russia's war of aggression. Bill, I think it's striking that these Western leaders are framing this Oreshnik strike not as a sign of Russian strength, but as a sign of Russian weakness. Do you see it that way?
Well, I would say that the size of the attack, these large attacks, and the use of Oreshnik as well, are a sign that Russia is frustrated. That Russia thought it had momentum for a year or so, up until 6 months or so, on the battlefield, and now the Ukrainians have turned that around. This has caused a lot of angst among the hardliners in Russia. There's a lot of hardliner pressure on Putin for failures, military failures, and now economic failures are coming more to the fore in Russia. So President Putin, by all accounts, is under greater pressure, but he still wants to pursue the war. He may be more interested in negotiations, unclear. But sometimes, even if you're interested in negotiations, you still want to keep up the fighting on the battlefield to try to get some leverage from that.
Do you see, there is this talk about pressure on Putin, the economic pressure on Russia, the high casualty numbers on Russia, and speculation that he may want to bring this war to an end. Do you see this as an escalation to up the stakes in upcoming peace talks, or is this just an escalation in the war?
So the size of the attack last night in Ukraine suggests a certain Russian frustration that the Ukrainians so far are not scared. It's kind of hard in the Kremlin for Kremlin leaders who are not accustomed to democratic societies to understand why the Ukrainians are still willing to fight despite all the military pressure from Russia. So the courage that Ukrainians are showing is really difficult for the Kremlin to understand. They don't have the same experience, haven't had the same problem in ruling Russians. So the Kremlin is frustrated, but it's hard to know whether they're about to cave and negotiate, pull back troops, whatever. It could happen. The last time Moscow invaded a neighbor was in the 1980s, and they fought a war in Afghanistan. And what they ended up doing was just pulling out. There was a lot of frustration with that war, and they were pulling out. That could happen in Ukraine, or they could pursue some other course.
Bill, how much escalation or how much room for further escalation do you see here? Because it sounds like the message of these blanks sent by the Oreshnik is kind of, watch out, Ukraine, because next time a strike like this could be worse. Maybe there would be conventional or nuclear warhead attached to it, and there's nothing you can do about it because you haven't managed to shoot this down. So I'm just wondering, is this, do you see room for more escalation from here? Russia
could go nuclear. That's something that Putin's generals talked about 4 years ago. But the Western reaction will be very strong to that, military, economic, and other things. And so that would be a step that Russia would be very careful about. President Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi in India, 4 years ago when Putin was thinking about this, warned him publicly not to go nuclear. So Russia would really have to contend also with pressure from China. China does not want to be supporting Russia that's using nuclear weapons and fighting what has been a losing war for them.
Let's talk a little bit about what options Ukraine has at this point. We've been seeing increasingly in recent months that Ukraine is willing to bring the war back to Russian territory, striking targets deep inside Russia. Would it be possible for Russia to attack and take out the Oreshnik launch base?
That is possible. The Ukrainians have already had some success in that area at Kapustin Yar. The main problem for Ukraine is to continue to hit a diverse set of targets, military and war-supporting industries like the oil industry in Russia. And they've done really very, very good job of that. The Europeans, as President Trump has pulled back U.S. support for Ukraine, Europeans have stepped forward in really a remarkably successful way. So I think what's frustrating for the Russians right now, to some extent, is they can escalate, but the Europeans show every sign of standing right behind Ukrainians, giving them more military support. So the Russians don't see an easy way out.
Right. In the early years of the war, European reactions were often shaped by fear of provoking Putin too much and triggering further escalation. Do you see a major shift in how Europeans have maybe moved beyond that logic?
Yes, David, that's the most dramatic part of the change in Europe and so to some extent the U.S., because President Biden at the beginning was a little wary about escalating by providing bigger weapons like artillery pieces or other things. But it's pretty clear now that the Europeans, the United States, and Ukraine are all pretty sure that if they go ahead and escalate, that Russia is not going to do something dramatic, irresponsible, like launching a nuclear weapon. So the Europeans are now, they really are turning NATO into a European-led NATO that is playing as successful a role in Ukraine as one could imagine.
William Courtney with the Rand Corporation in Washington. Thanks so much for your time, Bill.
You're quite welcome, David.
What do you think? Is Russia's Oreshnik missile a threat for Western Europe? Let us know in the comments. And if you liked this video, please hit that like button. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe.